Well, we're at 11:10, so we shall resume the hearing. Where we left it, I think, I was going to open conversation out a little further. Mr. Coursier.
Thank you, sir. I'm going to speak as a planner, so I obviously don't have any expertise in transport modelling, so I'm not even going to attempt to go there. But we generally endorse what Mr. Merritt has said about the accordance with the planning practice guidance. And so we also endorse his view of his legal status in terms of this examination, insofar it is guidance which you need to take into account. And if you were to not follow it, sir, you would need to give reasons why. And so obviously the PPG has been, various elements of the PPG has been discussed throughout this examination. So as we say in our hearing statement, we think the key elements in the paragraph, in the sixth paragraph, have not been properly addressed by the Council. And we give instances in our hearing statement. But I hear the response from the Council that much of this is implicit in the modelling. So being implicit is not the same thing as actually being properly considered, and it's whether you have evidence on those key matters in paragraph 6, so which you will need to determine. And so I won't go any further than that because I think Mr. Merritt's discussed it fairly fully. So can I just pick up on this point on the SA? And again, this is something which we've discussed numerous times now at this examination. But just to make the simple point, the SA is not a substitute for good technical evidence. As put forward by the Council, it is simply, in most cases, is simply an assertion of a position which is not supported by evidence. So it doesn't, for there to simply be an assertion that X will not cause severe traffic problems isn't evidence. It is just, as I say, an assertion. So just dealing with certainly, sir, the SA should not replace, is not a substitute for the type of transport assessment which is required by the PPG. And so can I just pick up on this point, just a matter of detail, sir, on paragraph 10 of the PPG. And so the wording there is that transport assessments will ensure that any proposed land allocation impact is considered in the context of two alternative scenarios, with development and without development, and will enable a comparative analysis of the transport effects of the proposed allocation. So the Council hasn't done that in our submission, sir. The Council presented you with one based upon the local plan strategy, which we fully accept. That's the with development. The alternative, sir, the without, sir, is just simply taking the level of development which is planned for by the local plan and distributing it differently, as I understand it. And so that is not the with and without which the PPG requires. I stand to be corrected, but that's what I understand is the difference and why there's such small differences. And of course, that doesn't help you because you have to grapple with the paragraph 14 issue of NPPF, of whether the actual levels of development planned for by the local plan will cause unacceptable impacts. And that's why paragraph 10 refers to a without development in our submission. And so what we do see, and I think what we do see when you look at even the figures presented by the council, is very large increases in congestion. I don't know whether, sir, this is moving on to more matters of detail. I don't know if you wish to deal with that now, or because I'm moving slightly away from Mr. Merritt's point.
I'm content, that's fine.
So I think the starting point, sir, is of course the period for which you should be looking at traffic impacts. Whether it should be 2033 or 2038. Much of the council's documentation is only to 2033. And as the plan makes allocations to 2038 and beyond, we think that is not particularly helpful to you, sir. I think if you're looking at on the basis of the council's information, and so we do have some disputes about whether it fully assesses impacts, sir, and that's set out in our hearing statement. I won't go into that because I don't think I need to for the points I want to make. But sir, it is the best table to look at, I think, is the Wood document, which is EXCYC 87A. So we set this out in our hearing statement. And on page 40, which then compares journey times 2019 to 2040. And why we think 2040 is useful, because it obviously then takes into account the full development of sites such as ST15 and so forth, the larger sites, which isn't taken into account by the 2033 figure. And what you see, sir, in the final column, in the final three columns of that document, are very significant increases in travel time, particularly in relation to the routes which most affect the southeast quadrant of the city, in terms of the A19 and the A1079. And indeed, very importantly, sir, for air quality, you see very significant increases on the inner ring roads. So I think, sir, in terms of that's routes 4, 5 and 16, sir, in that document. And you see increase in travel time well in excess of 30%, and in some cases nearing 50%. So obviously what is a severe impact is a matter of judgment. We think that that constitutes a severe impact. Indeed, sir, we in terms, and here I'm going into a little bit of detail, sir, unfortunately, because I think we left this issue of the traffic impacts of ST15 to this session, if you recall, from phase, I can't remember which phase it was, phase 2 or phase 3.
We did ST15 in phase 3. We didn't leave it over till now. We did it in phase 3. And indeed, Mr. Jones was here and asked for his comments at the time.
So I think that was the week I missed at the end of the phase 3 hearings.
Sir, I recall saying to the inspector that this was a matter we would return to in this session.
Well, you can't do that, Mr. Corsia. It's not in your hearing statement. And although Mr. Waring's here, I'm sure he'll object to having to go over the merits of his own site again on a detailed basis.
I wish to go into two of the assumptions which underlie the traffic generation from that, which has implications for the wood appraisal of its cumulative impacts.
It's not my habit to try and cut people off at these events. I want to hear what you've got to say, but if you can deal with it in a speedy way, let's put it like that. Mr. Waring, was there something you wanted to say?
I think, as Mr. Elvin has said, if we are going to go back into ST15 and discuss transport-related issues, whilst I have Mr. Irwin here from Ford Consulting, who's been dealing with the sustainable transport, our traffic engineer and transport advisor, Mr. Johnson, isn't here today, and I would want to then reopen and bring him back at a later date. So I am concerned that we are now going back over old ground.
I understand. Let's see how we get on, Mr. Corsia.
Sir, can I just say that, contrary to Mr. Elvin's statement, these matters are in my
Sorry,
hearing.
I was just about to say, Mr. Corsia, if you're just referring to the 30% and the 25%, is that what you're dealing with?
Yes, that's all I'm dealing with.
Well, we know what they are in that case.
Thank you, sir. It is the matter of the two things, which ST15 is one of the major generators on these two radial roads, where we're seeing very high levels of congestion on the in the wood report, sir. And that, sir, is based. One of the base assumptions, sir, is about 30% of the vehicular traffic from ST15 using Elvington Lane by itself, accessing the network from Elvington Lane. So we say that that's highly unlikely to occur. There are two issues here, sir, on the 30%, is whether the capacity of Elvington Lane, and so I'm not taking any point on that today, and whether that is whether 30% of traffic in the long term is going to use Elvington Lane as the main access. And so we say that once the grade separated junction has been put in place, then that, sir, is highly unlikely to occur, because the grade separated junction will provide a much faster and easier access to almost all the destinations in York. And the only means by which you could actually achieve the 30% would be some physical division of the site, some physical barrier which would prevent development accessing, 30% of the development accessing the grade separated junction. And so it would make the site very difficult. That would drastically affect the saleability of those properties. So we think, sir, that 30% is likely to be far too high, and that there will be much heavier loads being placed on the adjoining roads in the area, including the A19 and the A64. It's simply a much longer and less attractive route, sir, using Elvington Lane, than use what will be a grade separated junction directly onto the A64. And so the second point, sir, is the assumption that 25% of trips will be to the University of York. We think, again, that's highly unlikely. if you just look at, obviously, the only basically there are no shops, no primary school, no secondary school, so within the university. So we are the only facility in the University of York would be the sports village, which might attract non-journey to works. And even when you look at the journey to work figures, just on a rough calculation, that there will be about 4,000 plus people with jobs living in the ST15 and possibly 6,000 jobs at the University of York. The proportion of the University of York employees living in ST15 makes it highly unlikely to achieve the 25% figure. And that, again, sir, has a significant impact upon traffic flows. What we do actually think is that ST15 will prove highly attractive to commuters to Leeds because of its position adjacent to the A64. So those are 2 points. Hopefully I've dealt with them briefly enough, sir.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Sorry, can I just have a line? Sorry. Then I just want to go on to the strategic road network. And here, obviously, National Highways are here today, sir. But dealing with the concern which they raise in their paper, sir, about the Fulford interchange, that's the junction, sir, the A19 and the A64, where there are still unresolved issues. We're not clear from the paper or the statement of common ground what those unresolved issues are. And how far they would seriously affect your consideration. Obviously, that's a very important junction, sir, with it, affecting both Fulford and the rest of York. Which, again, sir, we are greatly concerned. What we note, sir, is I think it's a possible, there is serious safety concerns for that junction at the present moment without mitigation and further works. So I'm looking at the National Highways response to inspectors MIQ's 31st of August document. It says, without intervention, this would cause safety problems which are predicted to extend over a significantly longer stretch of the A64 and a significantly longer time. That's the third paragraph, sir. It then talks sir, about the schemes have been developed by CYC to encourage the use of sustainable modes on the Fulford Road corridor. That's the A19 corridor, sir. We understand that these will reallocate road space to sustainable modes. And they discuss that further, sir. What we are highly concerned about, sir, the A19 through Fulford is a conservation area, sir. And there are two implications. One, I suspect what road space actually means, and National Highways and City of York can clarify, what it actually does mean is taking part of the present grass verges and using those as cycleways. So the implication of that scheme would have a major adverse effect on the conservation area, because those grass verges are said to be a significant part of the character of the conservation area within the conservation area statement. And indeed, a similar scheme was abandoned, as I understand it, by the City of York some years ago for exactly that reason. And it again seems to be refloated in this examination as a way of dealing with this problem, this unresolved problem at the A19, A64 junction. And so we think, sir, if that is indeed a necessary part of dealing with that problem, it engages, obviously, Section 72 and the statutory duty.
As a matter of law, it doesn't engage Section 72 because it's done under the Highways Act.
So we would say that if that is necessary to facilitate development elsewhere, in your decision in your decision making, if it is necessary to do so, then it does engage Section 72. And so, sir, I'll leave that one with you. I think probably, sir, as an architect, you probably are better, maybe in a better position to take that view on that. But so in any event, it would have a very adverse effect on the conservation area. So at that point, I'll leave it.
Thank you, Mr. Coursier. I'll come to the council first, but I'm aware, Mr. Waring, that you might want to chip in as well. But I think I'll hear from the council first.
Section 72, just to be...
My recollection is it's to do with development and where planning permission is required.
It is. It is. That's not to say that you shouldn't look at the wider issues, but I think Mr. Coursier, as ever with legal matters, overstates his case. Can I come back to another respect in which he again overstates his case? He repeated yet again his concerns about the sustainability appraisal not being an adequate evidence base. I did address this at length in my note to you following his submissions in phase 2, and you'll see that note, I'll get you the name of it, it's the response to EX Other 20, and it's paragraphs 16 to 23, dealing with the relationship between the sustainability appraisal and the evidence base. And Mr. Coursier, by repeating it, doesn't make it right, any more right than it was the first time. The sustainability appraisal is part of the basis of the plan. It's a matter for you, of course, as I said on that occasion, and repeat again, whether you think the evidence is sufficient and robust for the plan to be sound. That's a different question. But Mr. Coursier constantly seeks to elevate points of substance to points of law, and it would be better if he just kept them as points of substance. But in my submission, as I have said many times before, you have sufficient evidence for the reasons we've outlined at various points in this examination. I've made my submissions already about how the traffic implications are perfectly lawfully incorporated within the appraisal process. I've also made my submissions about the with and without. I mean, Mr. Coursier, as a planner, should be aware of the fact that you can't justify mitigation unless you can demonstrate that it's necessary and directly related to a specific development. Similarly, with mitigation in a plan policy, we have to show you that if we allocate land, then we have to then the development is capable of being mitigated within that context. I note Mr. Corsier's detailed points, which go significantly beyond the short summary in his hearing statement. He is not a transport planner. Fulford have commissioned no traffic evidence, and those general statements cannot stand, we would respectfully submit, against the expert transport assessments, including the contribution from National Highways, and you'll recall the statement that was agreed in connection with ST15. Work is continuing, of course it is, but these are all matters which have been discussed between those expert in transport modelling and highways impacts, and in my respectful submission, Mr. Corsier's concerns are properly dealt with. I will ask Mr. Ridge just to deal briefly with those concerns.
Of course. There are a number of quite technical issues raised by Mr. Corsier. I'll just try and run through them in turn, and you'll forgive me if I haven't noted all of them down, and remind me if there's anything I haven't covered. So the first point that was made was about the fact that we cite traffic growth to 2033 in our assessment of whether traffic growth as a result of the plan is severe or not. And obviously, you know, we accept that if you look at the 2040 figures, the traffic impacts of the development of York are more severe than they are in 2033, which would be natural because they adopt the Department for Transport's tempo growth forecasts, which simply see traffic increasing over time. And we have discussed about whether that is a reliable way of estimating it for York or not, or more of a stress test. And everyone is now familiar with that. But what we learnt from the 2033 data is that actually alternative spatial distributions of development inflict quite similar levels of delay on the network. Some of it presents in different places, in different scenarios, but by and large the overall level of delay is similar, and the overall levels of delay seen on individual corridors actually vary very little. And a lot of this is set out in some detail, I think, in EX 87, and if not, it's in EX 91. And our contention is that, because alternative spatial distributions give very similar results for York, you have to have a way of mitigating it, and the local plan is key to that because it allows us to look at the cumulative impacts of development rather than it and coordinate our response between the different developments rather than having to pick up individual developments through the planning process, which is what we have to do as an alternative. So it is evidence for the importance of the local plan rather than the suggestion that the local plan is the cause of the problem, because the counterfactual is not the 2019 level of traffic growth. It's what traffic growth would be seen in 2040 if development played out in a different way. So firstly, there's that. Secondly, Mr. Corsier raised the idea about Elvington Lane and 30% of traffic using Elvington Lane. Now, we've tested this in the scenario modelling we've done. That confirmed that allocation of traffic allowed the network to broadly operate. Obviously, at detailed application time, that will be an opportunity to test other alternatives and see whether they are better or worse than that assumption. If it were to emerge that the 70-30 split were the optimal way for the traffic to be distributed from ST15, then we would look to condition that through the planning application. Mr. Corsier also talked about our suggestion that 25% of trips from ST15 would go to the university. I stand by that. That was prepared through best practice application of traffic modelling using something called the donor zone principle, where we looked at the destinations of work trips from zones which were adjacent to the site where ST15 is now, so looking at Heslington, Fulford and Elvington. And looking at those zones, that confirmed that 25% of trips from those zones access the university. We've got no reason or no better source of evidence that would suggest that ST15 would be any different. And of course, where those trips will go will be a function of the type of housing and so on and so forth that's actually on that development, all of which is to be determined. Mr. Corsier then talked about Fulford Interchange and the need to develop a scheme to improve the performance of Fulford Interchange as a pre-existing problem that we've been discussing with National Highways. For some years, both National Highways and ourselves have developed schemes to mitigate those problems. As we go forward over the next few months, we will be determining which of those schemes moves forward. And you know, but there are ways we are aware of the problem. We are dealing with it. We have schemes to deal with it. Finally, Mr. Corsier talked about the impact on Fulford Road Conservation Area and grass verges, suggesting that there is a choice between retaining the conservation area and providing sustainable mode provision down Fulford Road. I just wanted to say that it is not the case that we are considering a scheme which would take out the grass verges in order to put cycle lanes on Fulford Road.
Thank you, Mr. Ridge. Mr. Waring, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Sir, as you'll appreciate, I'm a bit disadvantaged in answering the technical aspects of this, and I will turn to the Council and the Council's answers to some of these matters. I mean, I suppose I'm no more disadvantaged than, say, Mr. Corsier, because I'm only a planner, and I do look to the experts on these matters. I think just picking up on a couple of points and not wishing to repeat, but the 30%, 70% split was a test that was undertaken, as Mr. Ridge referred to, which demonstrated the implications on the highway network. When it comes to the planning application stage, it will be determined through a transport assessment if that split is appropriate, if that split is deemed appropriate, and there is mitigation required in order to ensure that, then I am assured by our technical experts that that can be incorporated into the master planning for the scheme, and we've suggested such, and there is a recognition of that in the proposed modifications to the policy. The council's figure of 25% to the university was a figure that was put forward by the council, and we don't disagree with that figure. I think in essence, all I can say is that if there's any further need for discussions on this, then I will have to bring either Mr. Johnson back or we'll have to respond in writing on the particular issue, sir. But hopefully that's helpful.
It is. I take it there's nothing in what Mr. Ridge said about that figure that you would disagree with, though?
There isn't, no.
That's helpful. The gentleman at the back corner. Sorry, I can't see your nameplate. I don't have my glasses. Is that Mr. Jones? Great. Carry on.
Good morning, sir. Thank you. Obviously, I represent today National Highways on behalf of the Secretary of State for Transport, and it seems we're opening up the debate a little bit wider. I don't intend to recover what's just been said by the council and the developers in regard to ST15, unless there is anything further that you wish to ask of me. Again, I was content with the phase 3 responses that were given by the council, and I felt no need to expand upon those at that time. In relation to 7.1, which is where I believe we are now, and the document which you've received, which is the inspector's response to MIQs, which has already been quoted today. I'll very quickly, I don't intend to read through it or go back over it. I will simply summarise and sum up now in the next minute or so the position for Highways England. We're agreed, certainly, with the Council that there is going to be mitigation required on the strategic road network. That's the strategic road network only, which in this case is referring to the A64. That's not a matter of local highways that we are here to talk about and discuss. We've jointly agreed which junctions we're going to be looking at in the future for further modelling work with the Council. CYC are indeed proofing a number of ideas at the minute to look at the potential mitigation for the local plan in and around the entirety of the network, but also obviously looking at Fulford, which is covered in my response again at 7.1 in particular. We continue to work alongside the Council to look at the joint strategy that stakeholders are going to need to agree to, and the strategy which is going to have to come forward to deal with the mitigation requirements as they are or will be known in the future once we've done more work together. We are suggesting a small insertion, as you'll see, but that's covered off at my response to 7.2. That's to policy T4, but that again is something that we'll cover when we move on to 7.2 later on. I'll leave it there, sir, unless you've got anything else that you'd like me to illuminate you on.
Nothing at this point. Thank you. That's helpful. Ms Hilton, I'll come to you next, and then Mr Corsia.
Thank you. Heslington Parish Council. I think we were just wanting to pull a few different bits together here. So we've heard from Mr May, and anecdotally it seems true that new roads breed new traffic. And certainly, as soon as a new road's put in, everyone thinks it's wonderful for a very short time until that gets blocked up as well. We've heard about the climate change targets and sustainable transport. And I can't help feeling as if the dots are not quite joining up along the way. We've also heard a lot yesterday and more today about the synergy between, for example, ST15 and the University of York, and the percentage of journeys likely to be between those two places. I'm not exactly sure how that number's arrived at, but I'm sure there's a model which explains the destination zones. But let's take that as read, because can't do anything else with it, really. So if 25% of journeys, for example, are from ST15 to the University of York, then there should be a very, very easy, short cycle or pedestrian route between the two. That hasn't been put in place. There's a long, winding route on a difficult lane, which we've described already in phase 3. Whereas there could be a very short route, for example, from the apex of the pentagon shape of ST15 direct to the university over a bridge that is already there, as an example. That is, in fact, more or less the indicative route, which was the route that was consulted on, whereas all of the grade-separated junction and the link roads, of course, have never been consulted on, because they came out at the last minute in phase 3. I think our concern partly is that with these huge infrastructure requirements, the risk is that actually they don't ever get built because of the cost. And so my real question is, do we actually need, for example, a junction from ST15 onto the A64 at all? Because if we're really going to promote sustainable travel, and if we don't want to increase car traffic, We shouldn't be putting in new, easily accessible routes onto existing dual carriageways. We should be promoting, by planning, easy cycle routes. Sorry, I'm just letting Mr. Elvin have a look at the map. Brilliant, brilliant. Join our club. So this is an example, I think, of where those dots have not quite joined up between climate change targets, expected journeys, and, to be honest, the people who are perhaps making those journeys, who possibly are more likely to be interested in sustainable travel, and so on. And it would be nice to think that things are put in place which both meet the long-term future for travel in York and also protect the ecology, the sensitive areas which are around in our parish, and also protect Heslington Village. So, as I said, I guess our anxiety is that that grade-separated junction could be planned and on the drawings, but never actually built. And then there's a huge question mark over access to ST15 by road. And even if it is built, it's a very destructive proposition. So this suggestion would be far cheaper for the developers. It's not quite as easy for them because they would have to acquire land, obviously, but we're only talking about a very, very small strip of land as opposed to a huge road area. So this is what I mean about trying to join up the dots and not just go with the expedient, obvious, let's build a brand new road over here. Thank you.
I'll come back to the council and then I'll come back to Mr. Corsia. Go on.
Can I just ask Mr. Ridge to deal with Heslington's point, please?
Yes. Apologies. I think, again, I made some notes, but if there's anything I forget to address, don't address, please bring me up on it. So in terms of the cycle route from, I think, what you described as the apex of ST15 through to the... Now, I think we've always failed to find a name for that bridge. It seems to be on a road that has no name. But it is the bridge that enters the bottom of the Heslington East campus. That is now shown on the policy mods map that was prepared for ST15 and presented to phase 3. So that is part of the proposal about how ST15 would be linked to the university for pedestrians and cyclists, because I would agree it makes sense as the shortest route. Secondly, my mind has gone blank.
Ian, can I just interject?
Yes,
and it
sorry.
might give you a chance. But when you're talking about that bridge, Ms. Hilton, is that the footbridge that you talked about the other day? That's at the end of Low Lane.
That's the bridge, yes.
And that can be accessed from Low Lane, as I understand it.
Yes, yes.
Okay, as long as I'm clear about which one.
Yeah.
I'll come back to you, Mr. Ridge.
There's a current right-of-way from Low Lane over the bridge round onto the other side of the A64, Oxclose Lane.
That's really helpful, thank you. Carry on, Mr. Ridge.
Yes, grade separated junction and the issues around that. I think, first of all, the issue, would it be built or not? Well, it forms part of the infrastructure delivery plan for the site. It's costed at £35 million. It's a cost that's been accepted by ourselves and the developers. The site is viable with that piece of infrastructure as part of it. So we have no reason to think that it would not be built, because it can be afforded within that development.
And if I could just interrupt, Mr. Ridge, in line with Mr. Jones' request in his paper, and I know he said it was coming in under 7.2, we have included that as in the proposed modified T4 as item Roman 7 as he requested. So that would appear in the modified version of T4 for infrastructure delivery for the highway network, strategic highway capacity improvements. Page 209.
Yes. So the provision of the grade separated junction is not, in our view, in doubt. There is, of course, a question about, well, you know, do you need this junction anyway? And I think that's a very legitimate question to ask, because obviously building a structure like that is, as well as financial cost, there is a significant environmental cost of building it. We did test traffic scenarios with 100% of the traffic going through along Elvington Lane through the Grimston interchange, and that demonstrated that that could not be achieved with an acceptable amount of congestion. It imposed very high congestion costs on Elvington Lane, Grimston interchange, the A166, which approaches from Stamford Bridge, and also Hull Road itself. So there is a rationale for a need to provide two exits, entry and exit points from that site, one of which is grade separated interchange. The option, I suppose, the alternative option of accessing the site direct from Fulford interchange was not looked at because Fulford interchange is already a congested junction.
Ms Hilton?
Yes, I don't think I was suggesting 100% of the traffic would go to Elvington Lane. By traffic, I presume you mean vehicular traffic?
Yes, because walk and cycle routes would be retained. There's a question, obviously, if you don't provide the grade separated junction, what you do with buses. Because if there were substantial traffic queues on Elvington Lane and around Grimston interchange, that would inflict very serious delays to buses, both to and from ST15, blunting the effectiveness of the bus service, but also, you know, any bus service that uses Grimston interchange, which is all the buses from Hull and East Yorkshire.
But even if you put in a small road direct from ST15 feeding into the university, that would be far less damaging than the grade separated junction, and that could take the traffic that is going into the university and through into York, which we don't know exactly what percentage would go into York, do we? And can I just ask, what was the reference you gave for the cycle route already being in a proposition for the direct route from ST15 to the University Bridge? Because I haven't seen that anywhere.
That, I think, is in the policy mods that presented to the Phase 3 examination, specifically the ST15 day. And I can see Mr. Waring and nodding at me to confirm that's the case.
I think you mentioned, Mr. Ridge, the policies map change, but actually it's not shown on the policies map change. It's shown on the proposed modification change, CYC 111, which is a consolidated proposed modifications of all policies, and it's SS13, and it's Roman numeral 13.
I'm sorry to labour the point, but does that specifically show a route that goes from the apex of ST15 direct west to the university? Because I have never seen that route in place, and it's going across 2 or 3 different landowners' land.
It doesn't show a direct route. It shows a route using existing lanes and improvements to existing lanes rather than creating a new direct route, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. I think those are the routes on existing lanes that we've already objected to in a previous phase. But I'm suggesting a totally different scenario. Thanks.
I think just to come back on the point about providing a smaller route into the university, direct from ST15, this isn't something that we looked at simply because of the traffic impact on the sort of university in Heslington area of large amounts of traffic using that as its principal access route. So it is not something. It is not something that we've studied, but we have not studied it because we discounted it at a very early stage as a method of access. In practice, because of the size of ST15, something in the nature of the grade separated junction is what's required to connect it to the main highway network.
Back on that, just very briefly, I suppose that illustrates what I was trying to say, that the dots have not been fully joined up, because we've got a plan that goes, I think, is it 2038? And we hope that in all that time, the number of cars will be reduced, and we've talked about reduced traffic. And yet we seem to be still putting in a plan which is basically car-based. And I would have thought that it was an opportunity to make a new garden village settlement that is a non-car-based settlement, which on the whole, people are not needing to drive out to the A64 to go somewhere else. And as Mr. Corsier has said, I think it is very, very likely that people will live in ST15 and want to drive out to Leeds, Pocklington, wherever. So I think that's what the point I was trying to make about actually being a little bit more visionary and not starting with the data now, but starting with the data that you want to get to. Thanks.
Can I just say, we understand the aspirational approach, and of course the Council, as you've already heard from Mr. Ridge, is developing its transport strategy, which will feed into the local transport plan. However, we have to accommodate the impacts as they are assessed today, and it may well be when the application for ST15 comes in, subject to National Highways requirements and the precise forms of the development, that there may be changes, but we can't simply assume those changes will happen, and we have to accommodate matters as they currently stand. And of course, accommodation is to be made for sustainable modes of transport, and that may be possible to be improved, but we're having to fix the plan today, and that may not mean that the aspiration can't be better reflected at the time the development application actually comes in.
I think I would also add to that the plan has to be looked at in terms of its spatial element and how transport is generated onto the network in its entirety. And obviously the plan contains a range of allocations. So whilst ST15 is a site that has good highway access, good access to the strategic highway network, the York Central site, which is nearly as big as ST15, is in probably one of the most sustainable transport locations in the UK. So it's, you know, and that is true of a number of the sites. Even the sites on the edge of the city have very high public transport mode share targets and aspirations. So I think just because there are sites within the plan that have good highway access, but it doesn't mean that across the plan all the sites have good highway access. Some of them are in fantastic locations for using bus, cycle, walk and rail.
Understand? Yeah, go on.
Just to say, ST15 is notable for having absolutely no highway access. Thanks.
Okay, well, yeah, it would have, though, wouldn't it? That would be the point. And I think that's the point that's being made. Yeah. I've got quite a few up now. Mr. Corsier, I'll come to you before we lose track. You probably want to come back on a few things.
I think it might be more convenient to take Mr. Bramley, who's also part of Heslington Parish Council, first, because I think
Okay.
you probably want to speak on the
Carry
same
on.
point.
Thank you, sir. Yeah, I was just wondering, Mr. Ridge quoted £35 million, I think, for the grade separated junction. This estimate was done quite a while ago, presumably. I just wondered if he's got an up-to-date estimate of that costing and whether there's a ceiling when it would become unviable.
I can tell you it's a recent estimate.
It was, from memory, I think it was an estimate conducted in 2019, and we updated it using the construction index to give a 2022 quarter 1 price. So, yes, of what I can't remember exactly what it is, to be honest. 35 million there or thereabouts. The value is shown in the infrastructure delivery note.
So that's a current estimate?
That's the current estimate. Well, it's an estimate at, I think, current price for phase 2 of the examination, but it isn't a 2011 figure or something like that.
Okay, thanks. Okay.
Mr. Corsier, then, I'll come to you.
So I just want to come back on a couple of points very briefly. I'm still very unclear what National Highways' position is in relation to the need for works on the Fulford Road corridor. They do devote a substantial part of their statement to it, which would imply that it is necessary to make the levels of local plan development acceptable. And so I'm very gratified by Mr. Ridge saying that it doesn't involve the grass verges. The alternative, however, would seem to be that it means elimination of the parking along that road, because otherwise it's talking about reallocation of road space. I can't see that you're going to close the whole of A19 to private vehicles, so it must be taking out the parking. It would be useful to know what Mr. Ridge is actually talking about, but if you were to take out the parking, sir, that would have a major impact again on the viability of the shops, services, and indeed the residents who live along that road, which again form a very important part of the character of the conservation area. It's one of those questions, so we have a elliptical comment in the National Highways, which actually we're trying to guess what it means. But whatever logical, whatever reasonable interpretation it does would seem to have tremendous implications for a conservation area, whichever way you take it. So just saying, so that's the first point, and I think I would like some clarification on that point. Second point, sir, is this question of with and without development of the PPG. Without development, I agree with Mr. Ridge, isn't the 2019 level. He is right on that. But what it is, sir, in my submission, would be that it is the, if you apply national and regional growth factors to the 2019 level of traffic. It's not to take the planned level of development in the local plan and distribute it differently, which is what Mr. Ridge is actually interpreting it to mean.
No, just for clarity, the way that we've prepared that is we have taken a national forecast of growth and distributed it differently across the York network according to the spatial distribution of development within the local plan.
So you haven't just applied 2019 levels, you've grossed it up for the national forecasts.
Yes, the model for the future year scenarios is the 2019 observed level of traffic growth by Tempro, which is the national trip end model forecasts for traffic growth over time.
So I accept that. I can't be making myself clear. As I understand it, the alternative strategy is distributing the same level of development in the local plan, but in a different way over the local plan area. Is that right? Is that how I've interpreted your document?
It is, because that's implicit within Tempro.
So
If I could point out to Mr.
I'm struggling at the end. I don't have the technical expertise to engage any further in this debate. I'll leave it to you, sir. That's all I want to say. Thank you.
Mr. Jones, was there anything you wanted to say or anything you could help Mr. Coursier with on what you meant about the Fulford interchange?
There are no specific questions there, sir, for National Highways at the moment. The paragraph that's being quoted from my response to MIQs is that we understand that these will reallocate road space to sustainable modes, hence further work and evidence will be required as we move on. And I think that is quite clearly the Council and the joint position of National Highways, as and when these ideas for mitigation gain more traction, gain more meat to the bone, it will become evident what exactly they're going to look like. But at the moment, there is no specific or specified plan or design, certainly not that I've seen, and I know that the Council aren't working on either. At this stage of the local plan, we're looking at the high level. Can this plan come forwards? Do we have an idea of what we need to do in the future together to mitigate these problems? And I think that my statement actually amplifies that quite well.
Okay, well, that's helpful. Mr. Ridge, did you want to add anything to that?
I think the only thing that I would want to add about things that we may or may not do on the Fulford Road corridor is obviously there are a number of ways that we can address the issues that have been identified with that corridor. It is true to say that some of the delays on the Fulford Road corridor are caused by actually a very, very small number of parking spaces. There are 1 or 2 parking spaces in one particular part, which reduces the road to a single track in one direction. But we are talking literally about 1 or 2 parking spaces. The vast majority of parking on Fulford Road is off the carriageway, so would be unaffected. And anyway, were we to take forward an option which involved doing something about those 1 or 2 parking spaces, that would be subject to full consultation. But I think, irrespective of the development position, these are the sorts of things that we have to be looking at, if we're to do things like preserve reliability of bus services.
I understand.
Sir, can I just come back? We are not talking about one. I'll leave it to your site visits, sir. When you drive up and down the A19, you're not talking about 1 or 2 spaces. There is significant on-street parking currently on the A19.
But the vast majority of it imposes no problem.
Well, I'm grateful for Mr. Ridge if it's difficult to see, sir, what this reallocation of road space actually means. If it means elimination of 1 or 2 spaces, sir, it doesn't seem to be worthy of a debate, a local plan examination. But why is
thinking the same thing myself?
Why is it worthy of National Highways quoting a quote in their statement, sir?
I thought that was I thought National Highways was about interchange, and I think I used the word interchange when I asked you, but let's not dwell on it. I'm happy to move on. Ms. Worthington.
Thank you, sir. I'm looking at a very discrete element of T1 dealing with the provision of funding for bus routes in the strategic sites.
But we're still on 7.1 though, aren't we? Not 7.2. Or are we moving on to 7.2? I mean, I'm quite happy to do
Sorry.
so. Yeah, no, I'm not suggesting you shouldn't. It's just...
Is there anything else anyone has specific to 7.1 then, or can we just move it along? I'm grateful. Carry on then. Yeah. No.
I think Mr. Waring wanted to come back in then.
Sorry, Mr. Waring.
So it was a point of clarification, and appreciative that you weren't at hearing session 3 on ST15. And I appreciate you will obviously collaborate with your fellow inspector on these matters, but just to put down a marker in relation to the A19, A64 junction discussions, those are aspects that are, we say, largely unrelated to ST15, and they are matters that need to be resolved, and they need to be resolved in advance of ST15 coming forward, but are unrelated to ST15, so just so that it was in your knowledge bank.
That's helpful, thank you. Can I come to Ms Worthington? Yeah, go on.
Sorry, so I said what I said when I said it because I believe that if bus improvements aren't put in sufficiently, it has the potential to mean that the improvements to the transport network, in terms of provision of sustainable public transport, can't be made, and therefore the impacts are likely to be severe as a result of some of the strategic sites, certainly. So it's partly in 7.1, but it's mainly in 7.2.
I don't follow.
It's specifically in relation to the provision of sustainable public transport to particularly the strategic sites. I've noted that the city centre site, which Mr Ridge was very helpful in saying was probably one of the most sustainable locations in the UK, it was necessary to have a provision of £3.9 million for sustainable transport, presumably buses, cycles, etc., in a very sustainable location. And yet, for ST14, only £1 million is required for the new provision of new bus services going out to the site. I know it is simply the extension of existing ones, but because it's going to add to the time, you will effectively need at least another bus or two in the services in order to cover that extension of those routes to the site. And similarly in ST15, £2 million is required for the provision of bus routes. This doesn't seem to be in line with the provision on the York Central site, which is in a sustainable location where it is easy to get people to use the bus because it's close to the centre. Therefore, buses aren't taking a long time to get into the centre due to congestion, and it's easy to get people to cycle and walk. The question is it justified? Well, we've had no indication from the council as to how much that £1 million, that £2 million for the ST14 and ST15 sites would provide in terms of numbers of buses over that 10-year period in which they are expected to provide for services according to policy T1. Thank you, sir.
Sorry,
Sorry.
Ms Worthington, if I may, can I just ask, you don't appear on my participants list that I've got
There's a hearing statement.
Right, okay.
Yes.
But who do you represent?
Erdon.
Sorry, I'm from Erdon Planning representing Mr Harrison.
Yes. No, there's a hearing statement, sir.
I was on one programme.
No.
Yeah.
We know who you are. It's all right, Ms Worthington.
That's fine.
My
It was
name
just
was
me.
here.
Yeah, that's fine. It's just who you're representing that I was interested in. That's helpful, thank you.
I'm not quite sure how this actually affects the policies, because this is a question of viability, and as you know, we produced viability evidence in phases 2 and 3. Erdon don't provide any alternative figure, nor do they explain why they doubt the figure of £1 million. I mean, all you have is a bare assertion in paragraph 4 of the hearing statement. There's no supporting material, but I'll ask Mr. Reg to comment.
Okay, I'll answer to Miss Worthington. So I think they're very reasonable questions to ask. And I think there's sort of two parts of the question, really. So why is ST5 different from ST14 and ST15 to some extent? And then there's a question about the £1 million. So comparing ST5 and ST14, the sums are not really comparable. The very large sums, which, again, I'm trying to do all this from memory, so forgive me if it's not quite right. But the much larger sum for ST5 is paying for quite large amounts of off-site bus lane, cycle lanes, junction improvements, things which are, not required for ST14. And in fact, the off-site bus lanes paid for by ST5 will be used, I suspect, by the new service that site ST14 will have. So turning to that new service, my background is a public transport economist. So I can tell you, albeit, notwithstanding the problems in the bus industry at the moment, providing a bus for a year costs between about £150,000 and £200,000, and that will pay for you to operate a bus for 15 hours a day for 7 days a week for a year. So that £1 million corresponds to somewhere between 5 and 6 bus years of a service, even if you collected no revenue at all. The intention is to support ST14 with a brand new bus service, because the site at Clifton, or the Clifton Moor Trading Estate, which is just to the south of ST14 at the moment, has a very poor bus service, and it's a council priority to try and improve that, and it's something that's actually commented on in our economic development strategy, that poor transport links to that site are making it difficult for people to access and take up jobs there. So the intention is that there would be a new service. Some of the costs of that would actually be met by our recent successful bus service improvement plan application, under which I think we have £2 million to improve bus services across the city, and not just in that location. But the £1 million figure, it is a slightly broad brush figure, but it has been accepted by the developer as part of the viability assessment. As I say, it relates to 5 to 6 bus years. It is broadly the same as figures that we have used, or figures that we have paid for enacting new bus services in other parts of the city, like the Poppleton Bar Park and Ride service. So it is based on some experience. But I mean, my professional view, given the existence of a very large trip generator at Clifton Moor that already exists and is underserved by bus services, plus the housing within ST14, is that £1 million is an entirely appropriate figure for a bus service to that location, and would meet the relevant 10-year horizon for providing one set out in our policies.
Yes, thank you, sir. I note that the council got a grant of £8.4 million, which bought 44 buses fairly recently. If we're talking about a new bus service, I'm presuming that we're thinking about 4 services an hour as a minimum of something that's going to encourage people to travel by non-private car means. That would presumably require at least 4 new buses, which would take quite a substantial part of your £1 million to start with, so leaving you with very little for that actual 10-year running process. If you've got to buy new buses to start with, £1 million just doesn't go anywhere. And in terms of Mr. Elving asking why we haven't provided evidence, it's not the objector's requirement to provide evidence. The local authority needs to justify their plan. At present, it is unjustified. No evidence has been provided on this type of issue, and therefore it's unsound at the present time.
I understand your point. Mr. Ridge?
Of course. I'm going to clear up a common misapprehension now about how we buy bus services. The council buys the service, it doesn't buy the bus. So the 150 to 200,000 pound per year figure is for operating a bus service, and within that is the cost of the vehicle. It's not comparable to the recent Zebra grant that we were awarded for buying 44 electric vehicles, because the buses themselves would have an asset life of